זה עובד? Hello, everyone. So I'm Guy Ben-Porat, a lecturer at Ben-Gurion. It's both an honor and a pleasure to introduce Mr. Franklin Foer, who will deliver the annual keynote presentation under the auspices of the Robert St. John Chair in Objective Middle East Reporting. I will get to objective a bit later, but let me start with the main thing here. Many of us are familiar with Foer's book, How Football Explains the World. And some of us here, that will be sufficient to give him a prize. And I see some faces here who will agree this is good enough for a prize from anyone writing about football and the world. However, he has also written for Slate Magazine, New York Magazine, New Republic, and The Atlantic, a rich journalist career which is still in the midst. He also published 2 more books. One is Jewish Jocks. That's not the pronunciation, it's jocks, not jokes. And World Without Mind, the existential threat of big tech. Now, this award is in the honor of Robert St. John, and I would like to say some words about that and make the connections here. Robert St. John was an exceptional figure and writer, and he was what we call a person who spoke truth to power. To the university president, who expelled him, to Al Capone, who beat him up, and to many other people. He covered World War II as a journalist and did not hesitate to take a side and save Jewish people when he could. He was also wounded during that war. He was then a victim of the Red Scare, again, speaking truth to power. Now, all this information comes to me from a presentation made by Mr. Bert Foer, Franklin Foer's father, so you'll make another connection here. Now, let me go back to the objectivity, which I promised a minute ago. So, can or should journalists keep speaking truth to power? And how does objective reporting comply with that? Does that mean the journalist cannot take a side? And I will leave this to our speaker in a minute. And at this age that we're in now, of fake news and deep schisms, are people in general still interested in journalism that is about truth, which is about speaking truth to power? And maybe objective should mean being fair. At the same time, commitment to equality and freedom, which is no less important. I'm not sure that Mr. Foer will answer all these questions, but the title he chose for this lecture is quite promising. It is, Why Nobody Loves Free Speech Anymore. So, Franklin Foer, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Where am I supposed to sit?
That's what they want.
Okay.
You okay with that?
Yeah, sure. I can sit. Okay. Well, thank you. I think I heard Dan Blumberg use the phrase, not ecosystem, but ecosystem. And so thank you for your remarks. You've made my ecosystem blossom like the Negev. When the journalist Robert St. John attempted to persuade David Ben-Gurion that he should write the great man's biography, he was greeted with a test. Ben-Gurion wanted to prove the reliability of the man who he asked who wanted to tell his life story. How much Hebrew do you know? He prodded St. John. The journalist replied that his Hebrew proficiency consisted of 2 words, shalom and todah rabbah. Wrong answer. Ben-Gurion's face bunched up. A practitioner of sarcasm but not humor, the prime minister shot back, St. John, not only do you not know much Hebrew, you don't know mathematics. You know 3 words, not 2. Shalom, todah, and rabbah. And so, out of devotion to the namesake of this great university, I say with the fullness of every word, todah, rabbah. I'm honored to accept this opportunity because I was honored to know Robert St. John. On my desk, I have a file folder that contains a handful of notes that I received from Robert after he read some of my first pieces of journalism. I would recognize a note from Robert from a mile away. His big blockish signature like a logo advertising his individuality, consumed a third of the page. It was as outsized and grand as the man himself. His encouragement was diesel that propelled me along despite all the struggles that come with learning a craft. Robert St. John was one of the greatest men I ever knew. By the time I met him, he was well into his 90s. Despite his advanced years, I can envision him doing the sort of rigorous yard work that I outsource with many fewer decades under my belt. He was vigorous, but it also seemed that he enjoyed being old and being the living witness to history. Robert was more or less a witness to every significant moment of the 20th century, and he relished telling it all to any interested set of ears. His stories were vivid, but so was the storyteller. And I can't help but think those two facts are inescapably connected. We're doing the same thing here. Yeah. Even as a nonagenarian, he was usually the most dapper man in the room. A beret, a bow tie, a trim beard, the dandy's touch that made the whole ensemble feel effortless. The man and his stories had flair. When I knew him, he was no longer writing books, but he was still writing stories in his head and unfurling them with perfect detail, a mastery of dramatic tension, and an intimacy that placed his listener inside the epical moment. It's rare to have an occasion like this to pay tribute to a man that one actually had the privilege of knowing. And my sense is that even here at this university, which Robert loved and supported with as much passion as any Gentile, his memory has faded a little since his death in 2003. So if you'll permit me a brief homage, I promise you there's a moral at the end of the tale. So I'll begin at the beginning of his career as an adventurer. In 1918, he enlisted in the U.S. Army to go fight over there as a 16-year-old, lying about his age so that the military would allow him to fight in the war to end all wars. By the time he made it to France, World War I was actually over. On the ship back to the States, he worked in the hull, where the soldiers with amputated limbs slept in hammocks. When the choppy waters flung the limbless survivors of battle onto the floor, it was his job to place them back in their beds. His description of that task, in which it was so easy to recall the horror of Robert having to hold screaming men as they helplessly wriggled on the floor, of the dirty floor of the ship, did more to capture the perils of war than any anecdote I've ever heard. Robert came of professional age as the Zelig of the Chicago suburbs. He let the city's broad shoulders carry him to its most interesting denizens. He lived in an apartment over the garage of the Frank Lloyd Wright House in Oak Park. He dated Ernest Hemingway's sister and became a friend of the Hemingway family, although he only spoke of that relationship in the most hushed terms out of sensitivity to his wife, Ruth. Robert was always landing in good trouble. He was expelled from college for exposing the college president's efforts to censor an outspoken professor. Iconoclasm, which we'll about see, just about defined Robert. As a cub reporter, Robert exposed a prostitution ring run by Al Capone and earned a thorough beating for his shoe leather reporting. After filing a report of his account of his beating with the cops, itself a brave decision, Capone summoned Robert to a meeting in a hotel. "Heard a lot about you," Scarface told the young muckraker. Now let's sit down and talk. I'm busy, imagine you are too. You know a lot about me, I know more about you. Robert counted Capone among the two most charismatic men he ever knew. The other was Gamal al-Nasser, whose biography he would eventually write. Robert was self-conscious enough to recognize the draw of the strong man, even as every bone in his body resisted the appeal. To minimize the danger Robert posed, Capone bought the newspaper he worked for. Really, even more than the Robert St. John's chair itself, that's the highest honor in journalism. Of course, Robert left the paper. Over the next decade, the cub became a giant. The Associated Press, then the wire service of record, sent him to Europe to cover the next Great War. In Bucharest, he witnessed a pogrom that seared itself into his mind. The massacre was the beginning of his lifetime attachment to the Jewish people, and ultimately the path that led him to be so passionate about this land and to be so drawn magnetically to this university. My parents, Bert and Esther Four, who are themselves enthusiastic supporters of BGU, are here. We've been, the first time I came here, we stayed at the Desert Inn, which I think predates the Leonardo. And if you're complaining about the Leonardo now, you should have seen the Desert Inn then. And I think when you walked out of the Desert Inn, you literally walked into the desert. So Beersheba may not be the urban mecca that is envisioned, but it's come a long way. But we came to know Robert actually through the university itself. Robert was a presence at our seders. On those occasions, he would trundle down the stairs to our basement, an arm wrapped around his own to steady him on the descent, a determination to participate in the retelling of the master narrative of the Jewish people. At the Seder, he would occasionally allude to the great difficulties he faced, the moment when he was punished with greater force than anything Al Capone could ever muster for his iconoclastic tendencies. In the middle of the war, NBC poached him from the AP and hired him to be one of the premier radio correspondents in Europe, transmitting the grim realities of conflict into the wireless boxes of Middle America. Along with Edward R. Murrow, his rival, he was the voice of authority, drawing vivid pictures of faraway happenings to an anxious people. His skill as a storyteller was to create a sense of immediacy and intimacy. I'm going to quote a little bit just to give you a sense of how he captured what he was witnessing in Europe. War today is smells. Smells from the red-hot motors of the British lorries being run without oil on the quays of Greece so that the Nazis wouldn't be able to use them after evacuation. Smells of chemicals dropped from the sky to set houses on fire. Smells from burning oil dumps. Smells of roasting human flesh. War today is noises, especially the noise that the Stukas make when they scream down in a dive right at your head, with the wind making their sirens go round and round like mad. War is the noise of the bombs that the bombs make when they drop. Thick, heavy noise. Then the noise when the glass breaks and the walls crumble. Then the noise of silence. That silence which holds all eternity in its grasp for a split second and then lets it go quickly. Towards the end of the war, after he experienced the silence which holds all eternity in its grasp, he came home to New York. And in the final hours of conflict, he felt an almost aching desire to be the one to share the news of surrender. He set a record with all the hours he logged on air, waiting to convey the news. His tie at half-mast, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, sitting in the booth for 72 hours in total, a superhuman feat. With the end of the conflict abroad, Robert's war at home began. Robert couldn't resist his skeptical impulses. An iron curtain may have been descending, but he didn't see any reason to rush into a new global conflict. I don't want to live in Russia, he told the NBC audience. I don't like their way of life. But if they like their form of government, let them have it. That was his line, and he repeated versions of it in lectures. He was issuing a challenge, agree with it or not, that the world didn't want to hear. NBC censors began to insist that he submit his scripts an hour before broadcast. The Americanization Committee of the American Legion began to picket his events. Sorry. Robert was never a communist. He was a proud liberal, and his liberalism demanded that he dissent. As a mensch of the First Order, thank you, he gave away the bulk of his earnings to charities and causes, including $100 to the Southern Committee for Human Welfare. a group that J. Edgar Hoover branded a communist front. It says something about those times that these actions were enough to bring about his ruin. Given the national mood, NBC didn't want to have an outlier like Robert as the voice of its news division. In 1950, it fired him on the slanderous grounds that he was a communist. The stench of that innuendo hovered over him. There was nothing Robert could do to escape it. At the end of the war, he stood at the apex of his profession. Now, after losing his job, he needed to reinvent himself to survive. He wrote magazine articles and began to explore his newfound Zionism, writing a biography of Ben-Gurion. "My Goyischer Zionist," the great man called Robert. The height difference in the pair, not to mention the disparity in grooming, must have been great physical comedy. But the unlikely pairing worked. Robert's writing helped burnish the legitimacy and achievement of the founders of the modern state of Israel for a global audience. His books are a time capsule holding the idealism and romanticism of an era when a secular liberal Gentile considered Israel the most thrilling social justice cause in the world. A spirit I like to think that lives on here at Ben-Gurion University. But the implication that he was a Red wouldn't disappear. Robert began to spend time in Switzerland, an escape from the American scene that no longer had a place for him. On September 24th, 1952, the U.S. consulate in Bern asked him to bring his passport to the building. When he appeared with it, a foreign service officer took it from him and locked it in a drawer. For more than a year, Robert was a man without a country. Stripped of his travel documents, he was stranded abroad. This was in effect a perilous blow to his livelihood. Robert, ever the great storyteller, was a beloved lecturer. He made his income by traveling the American byways, speaking to churches and universities. But now he couldn't even set foot on his native soil. The experience turned him into a bitter crusader on his own behalf. He began to lobby furiously, appealing to his publisher for help. But his publisher hardly lifted a finger. His brother Archer, back in New York, became his fierce advocate. But he too grew despondent. And in the middle of his brother's crisis, Archer killed himself. Then, after many months, rather suddenly, Robert was summoned back to the consulate. The Foreign Service officer unlocked the drawer and handed back the passport. His ability to travel resumed, but the damage had been done. A brilliant career lost momentum. A reporter was forced to spend the prime years of his life warding off a smear. He was never returning to the likes of NBC or AP. We remember Robert for all the things that he accomplished, for his biographies of Ben-Gurion, Ben-Yehuda, Abba Eban, and Nasser, for his brave eyewitness accounts from the Balkans. But we also need to remember that he wasn't able to achieve because he was punished for his political views, because innuendo limited his ability to publish. Even after his passport was restored, the nasty implications hung in the air. To put it in modern parlance, Robert was canceled. Perhaps the greatest temperament to the man is that this whole episode never defined him, and he'd rather talk about his travels and the great men he interviewed. But I wanted to tell this story as a warning. It's not that we're precisely at a moment of suppression like Robert experienced. In most of the Western world, we are evidently not. But such a moment is not so hard to conceive. With the rise of a liberal democracy across the Western world, examples have begun to proliferate of governments punishing political enemies for dissent. Astonishingly, a company like Disney has recently found itself on the receiving end of recriminations for its position on gay rights. Because the company disagreed with a law sponsored by Florida's governor, the governor pushed through legislation stripping the company of benefits that it had long enjoyed. Witnessing the popularity of waging culture war on Disney, politicians in Washington have mused about passing a law that would eliminate Disney's copyright. It doesn't bode well that Disney, one of the largest and most beloved corporations in the world, is suffering payback for holding a political position. It's an object lesson in the state wielding its vast powers to try to enforce conformity. I came of age in what might be described as the golden age of free speech, at least in the United States. A world that followed the Sullivan decision in the US Supreme Court, which endowed the media with robust protections. A world that followed the famous controversy in Skokie, Illinois, when liberals, many liberal Jews even, fought for the right of neo-Nazis to march through a town filled with Holocaust survivors. That age suddenly feels quite distant. Towns across the United States are on a book-banning binges. Teachers are threatened for honestly instructing about the American past. Companies seem inclined to respond to the braying of social media mobs to fire employees for stray political remarks, sometimes made in the distant past. And there's a rising intolerance for dissenting views on US college campuses. The American Civil Liberties Union, which did so much to create the golden age of free speech, suddenly seems to blush at its past achievements. In 2018, the organization performed its traditional role, filing litigation that made it possible for white supremacists to march in Charlottesville, Virginia. That, of course, ended in great tragedy. And in the aftermath, the organization changed its guidelines. It now cautioned its lawyers to take care in representing clients with contrary views to the organization's own. That shift, I would argue, is symptomatic. The problem is seemingly everyone declares themselves a proponent of free speech, and almost everyone does so selectively. They claim the right for themselves and scoff when their opponents claim the mantle. Elon Musk may or may not be poised to take over Twitter with the stated claim of creating a bastion of free speech. But he's also gone off after his own critics with tactics that belie his claims to be a principled defender of the marketplace of ideas. Without a principled defense of free expression, where one's own ideological foes have just as much right to it as they do, the book banners will have the run of the field. To an extent, I understand why the golden age of free speech has come to a seeming close. Both left and right consider civilization to be on the cusp of collapse. To preserve the things that they hold dear, they are prepared to suppress the other side. If, say, a Donald Trump tweet has the potential to trigger a riot or diplomatic rupture, then isn't it healthier to just take Twitter away from him? I think many of his own friends probably shared that sentiment. But really, what is the problem we're trying to solve? And forgive me for laying my own cards on the table here. Perhaps by stripping Donald Trump of his digital megaphone, the world is stripped of the daily moment of anxiety when he hurls an outrage into the ether. Arguably, this has made the world calmer, and my own blood pressure doesn't run quite so high. But it has hardly stripped him of his political appeal. In fact, I would argue that by removing his running monologue from view, his power has, or his appeal has grown, or at least grown more innocuous. Without daily exposure, he seems more innocuous. And by shielding the world from Trump, his popularity begins to recover. Voters who rejected him begin to feel some nostalgia for his rule. So when I make this argument, I'm actually borrowing. It's an argument that shoots through the Western tradition, and one of its earliest articulation comes from the blind poet John Milton. His greatest work, of course, was Paradise Lost, about the Garden of Eden, the ultimate story of the human exposure to danger. But even before that, he wrote a pamphlet arguing for free speech called the Areopagitica, which also contained profound thoughts about the lessons of Adam and Eve. In the pamphlet, he was arguing against the power of the English crown in the 17th century to restrict the publication of religious and therefore politically subversive text. The quest to censor was, in effect, an attempt to remove the forbidden fruit from the world. But Milton believed that humans needed to be exposed to it, to be confronted with the choice, to consume the apple or not. That's the essence of freedom. To be confronted with the opportunity to transgress, that's the essence of morality. It's the teachable moment when humans learn about right and wrong. Long before John Stuart Mill wrote about the marketplace of ideas, Milton wrote beautifully about the imperative of encountering the opposing viewpoint head-on, of testing ourselves. It's so beautifully argued that I can't resist quoting. This is Milton. Assuredly, we bring not innocence into the world. We bring impurity much rather. That which purifies us is trial, and trial is by what is contrary. They are not skillful considerers of human things. They are not skillful considerers of human things who imagine to remove sin by removing the matter of sin. Good and evil we know in the field of this world grow up together almost inseparably. It was from out of the rind of one apple tasted that the knowledge of good and evil, as two twins cleaving together, leaped forth into this world. And perhaps this is that doom which Adam fell into of knowing good and evil, that is, of knowing good by evil. Milton's ideas were foundational for the Enlightenment, and they were the basis for liberal democracy. I'm just going to pause here. I think one thing that's totally underrated is the way in which writers like Milton and Hobbes were actually influenced by a revival of Hebrew that happened in England in the 17th century. There's an excellent book by a Harvard professor, Eric Nelson, called The Hebrew Republic, which is about the Enlightenment's debt to Jewish thinking. And so I think that Milton's idea, which was expressed in a Christian way, was actually, in its own way, profoundly Jewish. So Milton's ideas were foundational for the Enlightenment. They were the basis for liberal democracy. And contrary to much of the zeitgeist, I don't believe that they are remotely outdated. But our world has changed, and our institutions are struggling to sustain Milton's vision of liberty. Since Twitter is present in the news right now, I want to dwell on it for a moment. It's now often said that Twitter is the public square. Well, if that's true, that's a pretty dispiriting description of the world. Twitter is a company that exists to maximize the time that its users spend on its site. It does that by creating an atmosphere rife with outrage. It holds its users captive by stoking their rage, by creating a compulsion to pick up their phones to learn of the latest threat to the world. The currency of social media is getting liked and retweeted. The pathway to virality is pandering, stoking anger, playing to the base emotions of the tribe. Twitter's entire architecture exists to exploit the weaknesses in our human condition. It exacerbates our weakened political state. Back in John Milton's day, there were the makings of a new infrastructure of free expression. Coffee shops, printing presses, the newspapers and books that rolled off them. The essence of that ecosystem was its decentralization. With so many nodes, it wasn't possible for the state or any one mogul to capture control over the entirety of the constellation or even the bulk of it. That fear was the overriding one. That obviously isn't the case with the digital public square, where a small handful of websites intend to connect the world, concentrating the infrastructure of global speech in the hands of precious few companies who set the rules, who determine what speech is acceptable, which speech is worthy of attention, which is not. The whims of the owners and the technocrats who toil for them control the master switch. One of the paradoxes of this new world is that social media has created a mess, a public square filled with lies, manipulation, hateful spite. And the most commonly proposed solution is to ask for those companies to clean up the mess they created. Those who've already proved themselves irresponsible stewards of power are asked to assume greater power. In my view, this has it backwards. Our goal should be to have more pluralism. We need alternatives. The danger is when there are so few places with so much control over global speech. Government needs to give capitalism, through competition policy, the space to create a more variegated public square. More fundamentally, it's the job of universities and intellectuals to create a different culture of public discourse. The public has never had such easy access to a microphone with so little preparation for how to responsibly use it. In some sense, free expression has never been so free, and that has cheapened this precious commodity. If social media encourages the expression of the id, the job of those with cultural power should be to cultivate the restoration of the superego. When it comes to public speech, the first thing that comes into one's mind is not necessarily the first thing that should be broadcast to the entire world. We need to learn or relearn the instinct to meaningfully confront that which doesn't conform to our predispositions, which requires argument as opposed to knee-jerk dismissal. That which purifies us is trial, Milton pleaded. In the end, that's the only project for democratic renewal. Robert St. John made this point. In the end of his magnum opus, The Land of the Silent People, he described returning to the United States after the war and the stultifying atmosphere he encountered. As I said, he was a man who earned his bread giving speeches, but he wasn't ever encouraged to give his unvarnished view. He wrote, A lecture platform. The chairman has just one word of advice. Please remember that you're speaking after the dinner hour. Make your remarks pleasant. Don't make war seem too terrible. We don't want to disturb digestion, you know. Ah, no. America's digestion must not be disturbed. Robert saw it as his public responsibility to disturb. The fact that this chair in his name exists is testament to how productively he disturbed his compatriots and the world. The fact that he fell in love with this university and saw its potential at an early moment in its history is testament to this institution and the common iconoclastic idealism he shared with the project. May his memory inspire us all to continue to disturb the world in the best way. Thank you. Sure.
So thank you very much for this lecture. It was inspiring and certainly worthy of the prize. We can take 2 questions from the audience if anyone wants to present a question. Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Robert Spitzer from Seattle, Washington. And I am not myself an academic, but you mentioned how important it is for academicians in the university to help the dialogue and help a sort of responsible dialogue in terms of political communication. So I know that there's an issue that is in the United States in terms of campus debate about Israel. And I've learned a lot about this from other sources. My friend Elon Truman, who was here just briefly, who is a professor here at BGU and co-editor of Israel Studies, which is one of the key journals in the world for academic discussion of Israel. Well, in many campuses in the United States, there's tremendous peer pressure that makes it very difficult to publicly express statements sort of in support of Israel. So how in the United States can we encourage the campus communities to be more open for the principles of free speech and academic freedom?
So I have a daughter who is considering applying for university. Well, you know what? It should be in the picture because I think there is an issue at American campuses as it relates not just as it relates to debate over Israel, but I think as it relates to the ability to be actively Jewish on campus. That being Jewish or being having sympathy for Israel is seen as a source of shame, and I think that it really makes me profoundly sad that we've arrived at this point. I think that ultimately, I think this is a long game issue. I don't see anything I don't know how to fix it in the short term. I only have long-term solutions, one of which is that we really do need to be principled supporters of free speech and to kind of a demand that and to do it in a principled way where we let people of all sides speak and have the microphone in college campuses with equal access, or not equal access, but with equal, when they're without being shouted down. And then I think that there's a long game that needs to be played. What's happening on campuses is symptomatic, really, of the way in which I think progressives have kind of rethought Israel or moved away from Israel. And I think until there's a solution to that, which I think requires a lot of deep strategic thinking on behalf of the Jewish community, I think Israel itself needs to rethink its approach to many aspects of the diaspora. I think that it's kind of it's a real shame that Israel has become a partisan issue in the United States, and I think fighting against that impulse is actually should be among the highest priorities of the pro-Israel community. And I think that would help, but that's a long-term goal. I don't have a great specific solution to what you've just described.
Yes, please.
I have a question related to speech and why nobody loves free speech anymore. Speech, in a sense, assumes the ability to communicate in language. I've been following two debates, one that's seems seemingly over in Israel about the space of Arabic as a national language. I come from a jurisdiction, Quebec, where English is disappearing, not in the public sphere. If one assumes that speech is necessary as a vehicle of communication and is in essence a premise of free speech, the ability of knowing what the other is saying in the other's language. My question is this: what do you see in terms of the influence of government, the nation state, in determining the exclusivity of one language versus another as a means of communication, as, in a sense, something used to temper free speech? And I'm referring in particular to the legislation in Israel which granted special status to the Arabic language, but diminished what the Arabic language was from the founding of the state. And the interplay between the Declaration of Independence of Israel as a democratic state and the notion of language and its role in free speech.
It's a probing question that I hadn't actually given much thought to before you asked it, so I don't think I'm going to venture an answer to it without really having thought it through. Oh, sorry about that. I do think that we live in this paradoxical moment where the significance of the nation state has been contested for more than 20 years. I mean, the post-World War II dream really was about dissolving the nation state into kind of larger international communities, whether it was creating a global community, global law, creating a European Union, creating trans-American political unions, yet the nation state kind of remains as still the defining fact of our political lives. And the nation state really, I think, is more threatened from within than it is from without, where our ability to coexist with one another, to find, and maybe this is your point about linguistics, but to be able to find those common touch points of identity is the thing that we're struggling with right now. And I don't know if language is the necessary common touch point that keeps nation states together, or if it's a history, but we're struggling in all these Western states to be able to find that common historical ground that's shared. So, you know, I do think that this is, if the nation state is to persist, I think it almost has to as a means of democratic organization. I mean, I think the struggle is, as you suggest, to find those ties that bind.
So thank you very much again, and congratulations on the prize.
As we finish, first of all, I want to thank Professor Guy Polat for so beautifully interviewing Franklin. And Franklin, you're going to stay on stage because this is the point of parental nachas. And Bert and Esther, you're going to come up and take a photograph with Franklin. Franklin, please come and this is parental nachas. And for everybody else, just a couple of sentences of housekeeping. This evening, which is going to be wonderful, is also going to be outside, so it might be a little chilly. So if you have something, a jacket or something to wear, this is the time to go and get it. Lunch is at 12:30, and then straight from there to the buses to the campus. So thank you very much for being here in the session. Bert and Esther, please come up.